My parents made me cook and clean for my sister Chloe and her 50 high society guests demanding service all weekend. When I finally asked for a single moment of help, my mother laughed in my face and told me I was the only one in the family without a real job. I smiled, set down the silver serving tray, dropped my apron into the boiling soup, and walked out the front door. Exactly 1 hour later, my sister called me screaming through the phone, demanding to know who I had called because our mother had just seen him and completely fainted on the marble floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heat inside the sprawling suburban estate kitchen was suffocating. I stood over the marble island, my hands aching as I plated the 50th portion of seared scallops for my sister Chloe and her anniversary gala. Outside in the air-conditioned tent, 50 of Atlanta and her most elite church members and socialites clinked crystal glasses celebrating a marriage built on absolute lies. I was 33 years old, sweating through my clothes, functioning as unpaid catering staff because my mother Patricia insisted family must serve family. The swinging kitchen door pushed open, letting in a brief blast of cool air and the sound of jazz music. Preston walked in. My 40-year-old white brother-in-law carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone who believed his skin color and country club accent made him royalty. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, looked at my flour-dusted hands, and smirked. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and tossed it directly onto my cutting board. It landed right next to the garnish. "Hey, Maya," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "When you finish plating the peasant food, take this out to the driveway and give my Porsche a good wash. The valet parked it under a tree, and I cannot have bird droppings ruining the aesthetic. You know how it is. Or maybe you do not. I am sure you could use the extra cash since your little freelance gigs do not pay much." Before I could push the $20 bill back across the counter, the kitchen door swung open again. My mother Patricia swept into the room, her heavy silk dress rustling aggressively. She wore her position as the head of the church hospitality committee like a crown, always ensuring her public image remained perfectly spotless while treating her youngest daughter like a servant. "Mom, I need some help in here," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the exhaustion radiating through my bones. "I have been cooking for 14 hours straight, and Preston is in here ordering me to wash his leased car." Patricia stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from Preston to me, and her expression immediately hardened into that familiar look of deep disappointment she always reserved exclusively for my failures. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "You are complaining about hard work, Maya," she sneered, placing her manicured hand gently on Preston and his arm. "Chloe is out there entertaining the most important people in this city, securing our family reputation. What exactly are you doing? You have been sitting in your cramped apartment, making little online investments, and playing on your computer for a decade. Meanwhile, your sister married into a real empire. Preston provides for this family. You are the only one here without a real job, so pick up the sponge, do your job, and go wash his car." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had drained my college savings account 15 years ago to pay for Chloe and her extravagant debutante ball, claiming it was an investment in the family and social standing. I looked at Preston, whose entire empire was a house of cards I already knew intimately. I did not yell, I did not cry. The time for begging for my mother and her validation had expired a very long time ago. I simply reached up and untied the knot at the back of my neck. I pulled the heavy stained apron over my head. Next to me, a massive copper pot of expensive lobster bisque was simmering on the commercial stove. I maintained direct eye contact with my mother as I casually dropped the apron right into the boiling soup. The heavy fabric sank immediately, splashing hot orange liquid over the pristine stovetop. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in absolute horror. "You are right, Mom. I said, my voice carrying a terrifying calm that made Preston take a cautious step backward. I really should go find a real job. I turned my back on them, leaving the ruined food and the mounting chaos behind me. I walked straight out the front door, ignoring Chloe, who yelled my name from the patio. I climbed into the back of my waiting car and left them to deal with 50 hungry guests. Exactly 1 hour later, I was sitting on the velvet sofa of my downtown luxury penthouse, swirling a glass of expensive red wine and looking out over the city skyline. My phone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table. The caller display flashed Chloe. I let it ring 3 times before finally answering. Chloe did not even say hello. She was screaming so loudly her voice cracked through the speaker, breathless and completely hysterical. "Maya, what did you do?" she shrieked. "Who did you call to the house? Mom just saw him walk through the door and fainted. Get back here right now." I sipped wine, smiling at beautiful chaos. I pulled the phone away from my ear, allowing Chloe to shriek into the empty space of my modern living room. Her frantic voice bounced off the floor to ceiling windows, but I simply took another slow, deliberate sip of my expensive Cabernet. I pressed the end call button, silencing her panic with a single tap. I did not rush. For 33 long years, my family demanded I run the moment they snapped their fingers. Today, they would wait on my personal schedule. I walked into my walk-in closet, bypassing the casual clothes my mother always criticized. I selected a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her precious church hospitality budget. I checked my reflection, adjusting the sharp lapels. The exhausted, invisible caterer from an hour ago was gone. The woman staring back at me was ready to handle serious business. Downstairs, my driver held the door of the black Maybach open for me. I slid into the leather back seat where my 2 corporate attorneys, Marcus and David, were already waiting with briefcases resting on their laps. They did not ask any questions. They already knew the main objective. The drive back to the wealthy suburbs was smooth and quiet. When we turned onto my parents' street, the visual contrast was jarring. The carefully manicured lawns and luxury vehicles of the party guests were now surrounded by 3 dark government fleet vehicles and a large foreclosure agency van parked directly on my mother and her pristine grass. I stepped out of the Maybach. The heavy thud of the car door shutting drew the attention of several guests lingering on the front porch. Whispers erupted immediately as I walked up the driveway, flanked by my legal team. The front door was wide open. I stepped inside the grand foyer and the chaotic scene unfolded exactly as I had orchestrated. 50 of the most prominent socialites and church members in Atlanta were huddled in small groups, clutching their champagne flutes in absolute stunned silence. In the center of the sunken living room, 4 federal auditors in crisp suits were systematically cataloging items. One was placing a tagged sticker on the grand piano, while another reviewed a stack of documents on the coffee table. The jazz music had been turned off. The only sound was the frantic clicking of high heels on hardwood as Chloe paced back and forth, tearing at her perfect updo. Then I saw my mother. Patricia was slumped on the velvet sofa, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead by one of the church deacons. The moment I walked into her line of sight, her sudden miraculous recovery was astonishing. She shoved the deacon aside and sprang to her feet. Her face contorted with a rage so visceral it made the nearby guests physically step back. She lunged toward me, her hands balled into tight fists. "You malicious, ungrateful brat!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I knew you were jealous of your sister, but this is a new low, even for you." Marcus stepped smoothly in front of me, blocking her path. Patricia halted, breathing heavily, her eyes darting frantically between my tailored suit and the imposing lawyers at my side. She pointed a trembling finger at the auditors who were now watching the commotion. "You hired fake debt collectors to storm into my house and ruin your sister and her anniversary party," she yelled, spit flying from her lips. "You want to humiliate us in front of the pastor because you could never find a good man or a real job. You want to destroy Chloe and her perfect life because you are a miserable failure living in a fantasy world." I stepped around Marcus, standing inches from the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. My voice was calm, carrying easily across the dead silent room. I do not have to fake anything, Mother. Those men are federal auditors and foreclosure agents executing a legal seizure of assets. They are here because the bank sold the defaulted mortgage on this property. You are being evicted. The gasps from the church ladies behind us were audible. Patricia stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes darted wildly, searching the crowd for anyone who would buy her narrative. "Do not listen to her," Patricia shouted to the guests, her voice pitching higher with desperation. "My daughter is mentally unstable. She has been making up stories since she dropped out of college. She is just a bitter freelancer trying to ruin a beautiful family gathering. We are financially secure. My son-in-law Preston is a highly successful investor. I did not break eye contact with her. You mean the college education you forced me to abandon because you drained my tuition fund to pay for the extravagant wedding?" Chloe demanded. I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You stole my future to buy her a country club membership, and now you expect me to believe you are financially secure." Before Patricia could formulate another lie, the lead auditor approached our group. He was a tall, imposing man holding a thick stack of legal files attached to a heavy clipboard. He bypassed my mother entirely, not even glancing at her defensive posture. He stopped directly in front of me and offered a respectful, professional nod. "Madam CEO," he said, his voice projecting absolute authority across the silent living room. "The estate has been fully secured and all external locks have been legally changed." At that exact moment, Preston shoved his way through the crowd of stunned guests. He adjusted his silk tie and sneered, looking me up and down with utter contempt. CEO of what, he scoffed, a nasty laugh escaping his lips. "A neighborhood cleaning service." I stared back at him, completely unbothered by his weak attempt to insult me, because his entire fake world was about to permanently collapse today. I stepped past Preston. My voice remained measured, cutting through the silence. "Not a cleaning service, Preston," I said smoothly. "Though I do specialize in taking out the trash." I gestured to Marcus, who unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal folders. "For the past 10 years, I have not been sitting in my apartment playing games on my computer. I have been building a financial institution. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered socialites and church deacons. "We are a private equity firm," I continued, addressing the room at large, but keeping my eyes locked firmly on my mother. "We specialize in acquiring toxic debts, distressed real estate, and liquidating the assets of people who live far beyond their actual means." Patricia let out a shrill, nervous laugh. She turned quickly to the church deacons, waving her hand dismissively. "She is delusional," Patricia announced, her voice wavering slightly as she forced a wide smile. "My daughter has always had a vivid imagination. She is just a freelance graphic designer who is embarrassed because she showed up to an event looking like a vagabond. Please excuse her outburst. She is clearly unwell. Do not listen to a single word she says." I did not raise my voice to argue with her lies. I simply reached out my hand, and my second attorney, David, placed a sheet of paper directly into my palm. I held it up for a long moment, letting the chandeliers catch the bank seal before taking 2 steps forward and pressing it flat against Patricia's chest. She reflexively grabbed the paper, her eyes darting down to the printed text. "Read it," I commanded. "Read it out loud to your lovely friend's mom. Tell them what happened on August 14th, 15 years ago." Patricia stared at the document, and all the color drained from her face. Her jaw moved, but no sound came out. The paper trembled in her hands. "Since you are suddenly speechless, I will explain it to your guests," I said, turning to the captivated audience. "That is a certified bank record. It shows a complete withdrawal of $85,000 from a custodial college savings account. An account my grandmother set up specifically for my education. An account my mother drained 3 weeks before I was to start my freshman year." Chloe let out a tiny gasp, but I ignored her entirely. "You told me the market crashed, Mom." I continued, taking another step toward Patricia until she backed into the velvet sofa. "You sat at the kitchen table and cried, telling me the investments failed, and there was nothing left for my tuition. You watched me pack my bags and move into a terrible apartment working 3 waitress jobs just to survive. But the market did not crash, did it? You took my entire future and used it to pay for Chloe and her wedding dress, her reception, and the first house so she could trap a man with a rich last name. You sold my education to buy her a fake social status. Patricia swallowed hard, trying to maintain her posture despite her shaking hands. I am your mother, she hissed through gritted teeth, keeping her voice low so the guests would not hear. I made a financial decision for the betterment of this family. Chloe needed that money to secure a proper match. You were always too stubborn and difficult to marry well. It was an investment. I leaned in close enough to smell the expensive perfume I knew she could not afford. You thought I did not know. I whispered the words sliding like ice water between us. I found out the truth 5 years ago. I did not scream and I did not confront you. I just used the anger. Every time you mocked my apartment, every time you insulted my clothes, every time you treated me like the hired help I used, that anger to build an empire you could not touch. And now, I am here to collect my return on your investment. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of a throat clearing. Preston stepped forward, adjusting his posture to look as imposing as possible. He puffed out his chest, playing the role of the white knight swooping in to rescue his distressed mother-in-law from her unruly daughter. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook, clicking a silver pen with a sharp snap. All right, Maya, that is enough, he said, his tone dripping with boredom, as if he were dealing with a minor inconvenience rather than a federal asset seizure. You want to make a scene over some ancient grievance? Fine. Let us handle this right now. Name your price. The Sterling Family Trust will write you a check this second to clear my mother-in-law and her debt. Whatever trivial amount she owes your firm, we will cover it instantly. He uncapped his pen and poised it over the checkbook, looking around the room to ensure the guests were admiring his vast wealth and incredible generosity. We do not need your ghetto drama in this house, Preston continued, looking at me with a smug smirk that made my blood run cold. Take your money, take your lawyers, and get off our property before I have you arrested for trespassing. Give me a number and go back to your miserable little life. I looked at the silver pen hovering over the checkbook. I looked at Chloe, who was clinging to Preston and his arm looking up at him like he was a billionaire savior descending from heaven. Then I looked back at Preston, letting a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I tilted my head, studying his arrogant expression with satisfaction. Are you sure you want to write a check that will bounce, Preston? Preston lost his arrogant smirk instantly. He froze with the silver pen hovering above his leather checkbook like a man paralyzed by a hidden trap. Before he could muster a defense, my attorney David stepped smoothly past him. David picked up the remote control to the smart television mounted above the marble fireplace. With a single sharp click, the screen flashed to life. The jazz music screensaver disappeared completely. In its place, a classified financial dossier illuminated the room. The bold black header read, Sterling Family Trust Estate Liquidation. The entire room held its breath as David began highlighting sections with a red laser pointer. The numbers projected on the screen were undeniably disastrous. I walked toward the television, gesturing to the glaring red figures. You have been parading around Atlanta for 5 years, pretending to be old money, Preston, I said. My voice projected clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. You act like the Sterling name opens doors and demands respect. But this legal document proves the absolute truth. The Sterling Family Trust filed for bankruptcy 5 years ago. There is no generational wealth left in your accounts. Your grandfather squandered the very last of it on failed commercial real estate ventures. You have been living on empty fumes and desperate credit extensions ever since you married my sister. Preston opened his mouth to shout, but my other attorney Marcus handed a printed document to the closest church deacon. The older man adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the pages. Go ahead and read the leasing agreements, I offered, pointing a steady finger at Preston. That silver Porsche sitting in the driveway right now. It is leased under a subprime auto loan that is currently 3 months past due. The tailored suits you wear to look down on hardworking people are heavily financed on 6 maxed-out credit cards. Even the gold Rolex on your wrist is a rental piece from a subscription service. You are a walking financial illusion, Preston. You are completely broke. A group of Preston and his wealthy white relatives standing near the patio doors suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. His uncle, a prominent local judge, averted his eyes and began edging toward the side exit. His cousins whispered frantically, clearly, realizing they were standing in the very center of a massive public fraud. They tried to slip away quietly, blending into the dark shadows of the grand foyer to escape the mounting humiliation. Not so fast, I called out, freezing them in their tracks. I would stay exactly where you are if I were you. Because being broke is not Preston and his biggest problem today. Being a federal criminal is. I turned my attention back to the crowd of church members. These were women and men my mother had served with on various committees for decades. They were hard-working people who had trusted my mother implicitly, and by extension, they had trusted the man she brought into their sacred congregation. David clicked the remote control again. The television screen shifted to display a complex web of bank transfers, wire logs, and hidden offshore accounts. You see, Preston needed a desperate way to fund his leased lifestyle, I explained, walking slowly along the perimeter of the silent room. He could not get a real corporate job because he believed honest labor was beneath his supposed pedigree. So he targeted a community he mistakenly thought was gullible and easy to manipulate. He targeted my mother and her African-American church. The deacons in the room stiffened their postures, instantly going rigid. I pointed directly at the tangled financial web glowing on the screen. For the past 2 years, Preston has been running a classic Ponzi scheme. He promised the church elders guaranteed returns on a fictitious commercial real estate development fund. He used the Sterling family name to build false trust, leveraging his white privilege to convince you all that he was an untouchable financial genius. But there was never any development fund. He was taking your hard-earned retirement savings and your pension funds, and using that money to pay his credit card bills, his car leases, and catering for this party. The living room exploded into absolute chaos. Several church members began shouting furiously, demanding their money back. One of the older deacons clutched his chest in sheer horror as the reality of his stolen future washed over him. Patricia stood frozen by the sofa, her mouth hanging open, completely unable to process that her golden son-in-law was a common criminal who had just stolen from her most loyal friends. The elite socialites who had praised Chloe and her perfect marriage mere hours ago were now staring at her with pure disgust. The illusion of the perfect white picket fence life was shattering into a million pieces right in front of their judging eyes. Chloe finally snapped. The reality of her ruined reputation broke through her denial. She turned on Preston with a feral cry, her face twisted in rage. She launched herself forward, her manicured nails digging into the lapels of his rented suit. "You promised me," she shrieked, slapping his chest repeatedly. "You told me the money was real. You told me we were rich. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone." Preston stumbled backward, trying to swat her hands away. The arrogant facade was completely gone, replaced by the panicked reactions of a cornered coward who knew his game was over. He grabbed Chloe by the wrists, pushing her away hard enough to make her stumble backward into the coffee table. "Do not put this on me!" he shouted, his voice cracking as the angry crowd watched in stunned silence. "You knew the truth." He turned wildly to face my mother and the church members, pointing a shaking finger directly at his wife. "She knew I was broke the entire time. It was Chloe and her idea to scam your mother." The entire room inhaled sharply, a collective gasp that sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the stifling living room. Patricia physically recoiled, clutching the fabric of her expensive dress. She stared at Chloe as if her precious golden child had suddenly morphed into a complete stranger. Chloe stood frozen, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color as Preston glared at her with pure malice. The absolute silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds before Chloe completely crumbled under the heavy weight of 100 judging eyes. She fell to her knees right there on the imported Persian rug, ruining her silk anniversary gown. She began to sob uncontrollably, admitting everything between loud, pathetic gasps for air. She confessed that she had discovered Preston was entirely bankrupt 3 years ago. The Sterling family trust was completely empty, and his massive trust fund was a complete fabrication. But the thought of losing her prestigious country club memberships and the intense envy of her high society friends terrified her. She simply could not stomach the terrible idea of driving a modest car or living in a normal neighborhood like everyone else. She deeply needed to maintain the grand illusion of extreme wealth at any cost to protect her fragile ego and superficial social standing. Instead of accepting responsibility for her own incredible greed, Chloe immediately did what she had always done. She frantically shifted the blame onto the woman standing directly next to her. She looked up at Patricia, her tear-streaked face twisting into a nasty snarl. "Do not look at me like that, Mom," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger right back at Patricia. "You are just as guilty as I am. You practically threw money at him from the very beginning. You were so absolutely desperate to brag to your church friends about your wealthy white son-in-law that you handed him a blank check." The church deacons exchanged horrified glances, murmuring amongst themselves as the massive scandal deepened right in front of them. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her voice reaching a frantic fever pitch as she decided to burn the entire family facade straight to the ground. "Tell them what you really did, Mom," Chloe challenged, her voice echoing off the tall marble walls. "Tell your precious congregation how you magically came up with $500,000 for Preston to invest in his fake commercial real estate fund." Patricia shook her head violently, stepping backward as if physically struck by the terrible accusation. She clamped her hands over her ears, but Chloe ruthlessly refused to stop talking. "You took out a secret third mortgage on Big Mama and her historic home," Chloe yelled out to the stunned crowd. "You forged the signatures and put a massive illegal lien on the house our grandmother worked her entire life to pay off. You handed Preston $500,000 in cash and risked the only real asset this family has ever owned." The congregation erupted into a wild frenzy of outraged whispers and angry shouts. Big Mama had been a highly respected pillar of their community, a wonderful woman who baked pies for church fundraisers and sheltered neighbors during hard times. Her historic home was widely considered a sacred landmark in our beloved neighborhood. The sheer disrespect of secretly mortgaging that incredible legacy for a quick cash grab was an unforgivable sin in their judging eyes. Patricia instantly realized she was losing the only social currency she truly valued. She dropped her hands and stepped forward, desperately trying to salvage her completely shattered reputation. She addressed the angry crowd with heavy tears streaming down her face, attempting to spin her massive financial crime into an act of pure maternal sacrifice. "I was solely thinking of the future," Patricia cried out, pressing her shaking hands dramatically against her chest. "I was trying to completely secure generational wealth for this family. Preston deeply promised me the investment would easily triple in a single year. I only did it to carefully ensure that Big Mama and her amazing legacy would rapidly grow into a massive empire. I just wanted to make our proud ancestors happy." I shook my head slowly, stepping right into her direct line of sight. The sheer, overwhelming delusion of her desperate defense was almost physically painful to witness. I signaled my highly capable attorneys. David pulled a thick manila envelope from his leather briefcase and handed it to me. I tapped the heavy envelope against the flat palm of my hand. "You did not invest in generational wealth." "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone that forced the entire room to lean in and listen closely. "You took a terrible shortcut because you were entirely too lazy to build anything real yourself. You sold Big Mama and her legacy to a smooth-talking con artist to pay for country club dinners and leased luxury cars. You risked the solid roof over your own head just to heavily impress people who do not even care about you." Patricia glared at me, her fake tears drying up instantly as her intense defensive anger quickly returned. "It was a very temporary loan," she snapped, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I was always going to pay the bank back as soon as the massive investment officially cleared. The family house is still perfectly fine." I untied the small string on the manila envelope and slowly pulled out the crisp legal deed, heavily stamped with the official county seal. "That is exactly where you are completely wrong," I replied, holding the long deed up high for her to clearly see. "The bank noticed the missed payments 6 months ago. They realized the mortgage was completely underwater and angrily flagged it for immediate foreclosure. They were going to auction off Big Mama and her house to the highest bidder by the end of the year. But luckily, the bank sold your defaulted mortgage to me." I tossed the thick stack of legal documents directly onto the glass coffee table. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. The papers slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from Patricia and her trembling knees. Every single person in the sunken living room stared at the bold red ink stamped across the top page. "Notice of foreclosure and transfer of deed." "Look closely at the signatures, Mom," I instructed, keeping my tone devoid of any sympathy. "Look at the municipal seals. Look at the transfer of ownership. As of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, Obsidian Holdings officially assumed total control of this property. You do not own the walls. You do not own the ground beneath your feet. You are currently standing in my house." Patricia stared at the paperwork as if it were a venomous snake. She shook her head side to side, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her immediate reality. "You cannot do this. Big Mama left this house to me. It is my birthright. It is my legacy." "You forfeited your birthright the second you signed those fraudulent loan documents," I shot back, stepping around the coffee table. "You traded your legacy to fund a criminal enterprise so your favorite daughter could pretend she married a billionaire. You gambled with our family history and you lost completely. Now I am collecting the debt." I turned my back on my mother and addressed Chloe, who was still sobbing on the Persian rug. The sheer panic in her eyes was intoxicating. I looked between the two women, who had made my youth a living nightmare. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Tomorrow, at exactly this time, my private security team will arrive to physically remove you. You will take only your clothing and your personal toiletries. You will leave Big Mama and her antique furniture. You will leave the silver. You will leave the artwork. If a single fixture is missing from this estate, I will personally have you both arrested for grand larceny." The church ladies standing near the grand piano gasped in unison. The brutal reality of the eviction was finally setting in. Patricia Wilson, the undisputed queen of their social circle, was being thrown out onto the street by her own discarded daughter. The humiliation was absolute. Just as David began packing the files away, a booming voice cut through the tense silence of the living room. "Now you listen here, young lady." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Reverend Thomas stepped forward. He was an imposing figure, a man who had led their prestigious congregation for over 2 decades. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than a reliable used car, and a heavy gold cross rested against his chest. He carried himself with the absolute arrogance of a man who was used to his word being treated as unquestionable law. He walked directly up to me, his chest puffed out, his expression dripping with righteous indignation. "I will not stand by and watch you destroy your family like this." Reverend Thomas thundered, his rich baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "This is a house of God and a house of love. You are letting bitterness poison your soul, Maya. A good God-fearing black woman respects her elders and honors her mother regardless of past mistakes. The Lord commands us to forgive those who trespass against us." He gestured grandly toward Patricia, who was now leaning against the sofa, weeping into her hands, playing the role of the victim perfectly. The Reverend took another step toward me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Your mother made an error in judgment to help her family," he continued, his tone shifting into a condescending lecture. "But sweeping in here with lawyers and federal agents to publicly humiliate her is a sin of pride. It is vindictive and it is cruel. You are tearing this beautiful family apart over money. I demand that you act with Christian grace right now. Tear up that deed, Maya." Cancel this foolish eviction and save your family and their grace before the entire community sees what a hateful person you have become." Several of the older deacons murmured in agreement, nodding their heads at the pastor and his passionate speech. They expected me to lower my eyes. They expected me to feel the crushing weight of cultural and religious guilt. They expected the invisible, rejected daughter to shrink back into the shadows and obey the patriarch of their community. I did not shrink. I did not blink. I stood my ground and looked Reverend Thomas dead in the eye. I took a slow, deliberate breath and signaled my lead attorney. Marcus did not hesitate. He immediately pulled a fresh document from his briefcase and handed it to me. I held the single sheet of paper, holding it up between myself and the furious pastor. "Grace is reserved for the truly repentant pastor," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And you are the absolute last person in this room who should be lecturing me about pride or financial sins." Reverend Thomas frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in confusion. His authoritative posture faltered slightly as he looked at the paper in my hand. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, though his booming voice had lost a fraction of its volume. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I looked directly into his eyes, letting a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. "Shall we talk about the $100,000 donation Preston wired to your personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands last month, Pastor?" I asked, my words slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Or should we let the IRS Criminal Investigation Division handle that little discussion?" Reverend Thomas opened his mouth, but his booming voice had completely vanished. His face flushed a deep, mottled crimson that clashed horribly with his crisp white collar. He took a stumbling step backward, his hand dropping from his chest as the arrogant facade shattered. Before he could formulate a single lie, David and Marcus moved with synchronized precision. They unzipped the side compartments of their leather briefcases and withdrew thick stacks of printed banking records. They did not hand them to the pastor. They bypassed him entirely and began distributing the heavily redacted wire transfer logs directly into the hands of the senior church deacons. The rustle of paper filled the dead silent room. Deacon Hayes, a retired military veteran who had invested his entire life savings into Preston and his fake commercial fund, was the first to speak. He traced a calloused finger over the highlighted routing numbers and the bold Cayman Islands bank logo. He looked up from the document, his eyes burning with a rage so intense it made the air in the living room feel heavy. "You took a bribe, Thomas," he growled, stepping toward the pulpit leader. "You stood at the altar every single Sunday and told us Preston was a financial visionary blessed by the Almighty. You convinced widows to empty their savings accounts because you said God had ordained this investment. And you did it for a $100,000 payout." Reverend Thomas raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. "Brethren, you must understand," he stammered, his rich baritone reduced to a pathetic squeak. "The church roof needed repairs. The community outreach programs were severely underfunded. I took that donation to help our flock. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and I was merely acting as his humble vessel." "Do not you dare bring the Lord into your dirty thievery!" Deacon Hayes roared, throwing the printed bank logs directly at the pastor in his chest. "You sold out your own congregation so you could buy another luxury car and take trips to the Bahamas. You are a fraud and a thief." The rest of the church members erupted into a deafening chorus of absolute outrage. The polite restraint of high society vanished instantly, replaced by the visceral anger of hard-working people, realizing they had been utterly conned by their most trusted spiritual leader. Women who had baked casseroles for the pastor and his family were now shouting demands for their stolen money. Men began moving forward, closing the circle around the terrified clergyman. Reverend Thomas looked at the advancing crowd, then glanced at the federal auditors cataloging the grand piano. He realized with sudden horrifying clarity that if he stayed in this house another minute, he would not just be answering to an angry mob. He would be answering to federal investigators. Without another word, the pastor turned and bolted. The man of God shoved his way aggressively through a group of elderly women, knocking a tray of champagne flutes onto the hardwood floor as he sprinted toward the grand foyer. He did not look back. The heavy mahogany front door slammed shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of stunned betrayal in his wake. I turned my attention back to Patricia. The transformation was truly a sight to behold. My mother had built her entire existence on the fragile pillars of perceived wealth and undeniable social dominance. She had leveraged Preston and his fake trust fund to secure her status as the queen of the neighborhood. She had hidden behind the absolute moral authority of Reverend Thomas to shield herself from any criticism. In less than 20 minutes, both of those massive pillars had been completely obliterated. She was utterly stripped of her armor. Patricia stood entirely alone in the center of the sunken living room. Her pristine designer gown suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous. Her carefully styled hair was slightly unraveled. The church members who had worshipped her influence an hour ago were now glaring at her with profound disgust. Her close friends physically stepped away, creating a wide circle of isolation around her, as if her failure were a contagious disease. In the corner, Preston was cowering behind a velvet armchair, actively hiding from the furious investors he had robbed. On the floor, Chloe was still weeping into the Persian rug, her makeup smeared across her face in dark, muddy streaks. "You have absolutely nothing left to hide behind, Mom," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "The fake money is gone. The corrupt pastor is gone. Your enabling friends finally see exactly who you are. You traded your eldest daughter for a mirage, and now you are left standing in the ruins of a house you do not even own. The eviction stands. 24 hours. Patricia looked around the room, her eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route. Her chest heaved. The logic and social grace she relied upon had evaporated, leaving only blind panic. She shook her head violently, refusing to accept the total collapse of her kingdom. She suddenly let out a feral shriek and spun around, shoving past a federal auditor who was tagging a side table. She bolted out of the living room and ran straight down the hallway toward the master study. The crowd watched in baffled silence as the sound of frantic tearing and metal clanking echoed from the back room. I crossed my arms, waiting patiently for her final pathetic act of defiance. Less than a minute later, Patricia marched back into the living room. Her breathing was heavy and erratic. In her right hand, she tightly clutched a crumpled yellow document that looked like it had been buried for decades. She held it high above her head, treating the fragile paper like an invincible shield. "You cannot evict me!" Patricia screamed, her voice tearing through her throat as she marched directly up to me. "You think you are so smart with your fancy lawyers and your corporate buyouts? But you do not know everything, Maya. Big Mama knew you were ruthless. She knew you would try to steal my home one day." She shoved the brittle yellowed paper mere inches from my face. Her eyes were wide and crazed with desperate triumph. "You cannot evict me!" she shrieked again, spitting the words with venomous force. "Big Mama left a hidden codicil giving me life rights to this land. You have absolutely no power here." Marcus stepped forward and gently extracted the fragile paper from Patricia and her shaking fingers. He produced a pair of silver reading glasses from his breast pocket and slipped them onto his face. The entire living room held its collective breath. The remaining church deacons, the federal auditors, and my private security team all paused their movements to watch the impromptu legal examination unfold. Patricia crossed her arms over her chest, allowing a deeply smug and triumphant smirk to replace the blind panic on her face. She raised her chin aggressively. She genuinely believed she had found the ultimate loophole to trap me. Marcus scrutinized the yellowed parchment, his expression remaining entirely unreadable. He flipped the paper over, checking the edges before handing it to David. David traced the faded ink lines with a gloved finger, squinting at the dense legal jargon scrawled across the page. The tension in the air was thick and suffocating. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the heavy silence suggested my mother might actually possess a legitimate defense against the eviction and foreclosure. I did not wait for my legal team to render their official professional verdict. I stepped directly between my mother and my lawyers, snatching the brittle document right out of David and his hands. Patricia scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as if my interference was merely a temporary annoyance of a bitter child. I held the paper up to the bright light radiating from the massive crystal chandelier overhead. The paper itself was authentically old and slightly textured. It was highly likely a blank sheet stolen directly from Big Mama and her antique mahogany writing desk. The dark ink was artificially faded, carefully applied and blotted to mimic the passage of decades. But the handwriting was entirely fundamentally wrong. It lacked the sharp, elegant cursive loops that our grandmother had meticulously practiced her entire life. Instead, the letters were slightly rounded, the spacing between the words was painfully inconsistent, and the pen strokes betrayed a nervous hesitation of someone trying desperately to copy another person. I let out a harsh, echoing laugh that shattered the quiet tension of the room. I lowered the paper and leveled a glare so intense at Patricia that her smug smile instantly evaporated into a mask of confusion. "You actually made Chloe forge this," I stated loudly, my voice carrying absolute certainty. Patricia opened her mouth to fiercely deny the accusation, but I immediately cut her off, pointing a firm, steady finger at the bottom of the page. Big Mama had impeccable penmanship taught by strict instructors in a traditional boarding school, but Chloe has always had a lazy, highly distinct flaw in her cursive writing. I took a step closer to my sister, forcing her to look at the paper. I remember sitting at the worn oak kitchen table for hours as a child, watching Big Mama scold you for this exact habit. Ever since we were in middle school, whenever you tried to write formally, you always crossed your letter T backward. You always sweep the pen from right to left instead of left to right. I shoved the paper back toward Patricia, tapping the deeply flawed signature block. You could not even forge a dead woman and her signature correctly. You failed at your very last desperate attempt to steal from this family. The color completely drained from Chloe, and her tear-streaked face leaving her looking pale and sickly. She stared at the backward letters on the paper, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the realization of her catastrophic mistake hit her. She knew exactly what I was talking about. That childhood quirk was staring right back at her on a fraudulent legal document, sealing her fate. Marcus stepped forward, his tone shifting from that of a corporate lawyer to a harbinger of absolute doom. Forging a legal codicil to defraud a financial institution and a property owner is a first-degree felony, Marcus stated, his voice projecting so every single person in the room heard the severe legal consequences. You are looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for this stunt. Chloe let out a guttural, terrifying scream that scraped against the marble walls. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed back onto the ruined Persian rug, her hands pulling violently at her expensive hair. She was no longer crying over lost social status or the embarrassment of losing her prestigious country club memberships. She was now weeping for her actual freedom. The spoiled golden child of the family was suddenly facing the brutal, undeniable reality of federal prison. She scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the disgusted gasps of the remaining church members who stepped away from her flailing limbs. She crawled directly toward the velvet armchair, where her husband was still standing. She grabbed Preston by the fabric of his tailored trousers, her manicured nails digging into his leg like desperate claws. "Preston, please," Chloe begged, her voice a high, frantic whine of pure terror. "Call your corporate lawyers. Call your father and his massive firm. Tell them we need a defense team right now. Tell them my mother forced me to write it. Please, Preston, you have to save me. I cannot go to jail. I would not survive a single day in a place like that." She looked up at him, her face a mask of pure desperation, completely dependent on the man she thought was a billionaire to rescue her from her own criminal actions. Preston did not reach down to comfort his hysterical wife. He did not offer a reassuring smile or a promise of expensive legal protection to shield her from the fallout. Instead, his upper lip curled into a nasty, contemptuous sneer. He violently yanked his leg backward, physically kicking Chloe and her desperate hands away from his expensive trousers. He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket, and looked down at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I am not spending a single dime on you, and I am certainly not going to jail for you people." Preston spat, his voice cold and devoid of any affection. He looked briefly at my lawyers, then back at his weeping wife. I already spoke with the federal investigators this morning. I handed them the bank records and the fake mortgage documents. I made a deal. The silence that followed Preston and his cowardly declaration was absolute and heavy. Chloe stopped crawling. Her hands remained suspended in the air, hovering just above the Persian rug, as the sheer magnitude of her husband and his betrayal washed over her. Patricia dropped the crumpled yellowed forgery. The brittle paper fluttered to the floor, landing forgotten next to her designer heels. The two women who had spent years worshipping at the altar of Preston and his perceived superiority were now staring at the very man who had just sold them out to federal authorities. Preston straightened his posture, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a sickeningly calm demeanor. He looked around the room, avoiding eye contact with the women who had given him everything. He spoke with the detached clinical tone of a corporate raider liquidating a bankrupt asset. "I had to protect myself," he stated, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. "The SEC and the FBI have been scrutinizing my commercial real estate fund for months. They were getting too close to the missing capital. When I realized Patricia had illegally mortgaged this estate, and Chloe was forging codicils to cover our tracks, I knew the entire operation was going to collapse. I am a businessman. I calculated the risks. The only logical move was to offer the investigators a larger target to secure my own immunity." Patricia let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. She stumbled backward, pressing her hands against her chest, as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. "You reported us," Patricia whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. "You came into my home, you ate at my table, you convinced me to risk Big Mama and her legacy, and then you called the authorities on us to save yourself from your own Ponzi scheme." Preston scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at my mother. "Do not act like a victim, Patricia. You were entirely complicit. You handed me that $500,000 in illegal cash because you were desperate to buy your way into the upper echelon of society. You wanted a wealthy white son-in-law to parade around your country club so badly that you never once asked to see my actual financial portfolios. You blinded yourself with your own greed. I simply capitalized on your breathtaking desperation. I gave them the forged deeds, the wire transfers, and the fake bank statements. In exchange, they promised me full leniency regarding my own fund. I am walking out of here a free man." Chloe finally found her voice. It was a pathetic, broken wail that echoed off the marble walls. "You promised we would be together forever," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "You said we were going to build an empire." Preston looked down at her with eyes as cold and dead as winter ice. "We built a house of cards, Chloe, and the wind just blew it down. I am not going down with the wreckage." The sheer audacity of his cowardice was almost beautiful in its predictable nature. He genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered everyone in the room. He stood there smirking at his weeping wife and devastated mother-in-law, fully convinced he had successfully orchestrated the ultimate escape plan. The arrogant con artist thought he had played the final winning card. A low chuckle escaped my throat. The sound was dark and completely devoid of humor. It started deep within my chest and quickly bubbled up into a full-throated laugh that echoed loudly through the sunken living room. The remaining church deacons shifted uncomfortably. David and Marcus exchanged a knowing glance. Even Patricia and Chloe stopped their weeping to stare at me in profound confusion. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the smug con artist. I raised my hands and began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate, mocking applause. The sharp sound of my hands striking together punctuated the heavy tension in the air. "You really think you are the smartest guy in the room just because of your skin color and your accent? Do you not, Preston?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You genuinely believe that you can waltz into a black family, steal everything they own, commit massive financial fraud, and then just charm your way out of federal prison by throwing the women who worshipped you directly under the bus? You think your expensive suits and your polished vocabulary make you invincible?" Preston frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly. "I made a verified deal with the federal investigators," he repeated, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant certainty. "I have the immunity agreement in writing. My father and his law firm negotiated the terms directly with the lead agent in charge of the task force. I am immune from prosecution. I stopped clapping and let my arms fall to my sides. I stared at him, letting a cold, predatory smile stretch across my face. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out a legal document or a bank statement. I pulled out a cheap, disposable burner phone. The dark plastic casing looked entirely out of place in the luxurious surroundings of the estate. I held the small device up between my thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light of the crystal chandelier. The silence in the room became absolute. Preston stared at the device, his brow furrowing, as a new, entirely different kind of panic began to register in his cold eyes. You have been having extensive, highly detailed conversations with a federal agent named Special Agent Miller. For the past 3 weeks, I stated, walking in a slow, deliberate circle around him. You have been calling him every single night at 8 o'clock sharp. You have been uploading the forged documents, the fake mortgage papers, and the illegal wire transfer logs to a secure encrypted portal that he provided for you. You gave him every single piece of evidence required to lock Patricia and Chloe away for a decade. Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Yes, he stammered, taking a defensive step backward. Agent Miller guaranteed my safety. He promised me immunity in exchange for my full cooperation. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of him. I raised the burner phone, bringing it level with his face. I tapped the screen once, unlocking the device, and pulled up the recent call log. I turned the screen toward him, forcing him to look at the list of incoming calls. I watched the blood drain completely from his face as the horrible realization finally hit him. Who exactly do you think you have been reporting to for the past 3 weeks, Preston? Preston stared at the glowing screen of the burner phone, his perfectly manicured hands beginning to shake violently. The specific 10-digit number displayed under the recent calls was burned into his memory. It was the exact direct line he had dialed every single night, seeking salvation from his own crumbling criminal empire. He reached out with trembling fingers, attempting to snatch the plastic device from my grasp, but David stepped forward instantly, physically blocking his path. I slipped the phone safely back into my blazer pocket. There is no Special Agent Miller from the Federal Task Force, I announced, my voice echoing through the silent room. You have never spoken to the FBI. You have never negotiated with the SEC. For the past 21 days, you have been communicating exclusively with Arthur Vance. He is a senior private investigator kept on a highly lucrative permanent retainer by Obsidian Holdings. He is my employee. The collective gasp from the remaining church deacons was deafening. Even Patricia temporarily forgot her own impending eviction and lowered her hands from her face, watching the immaculate destruction of her golden son-in-law. You set me up, Preston gasped, taking another stumbling step backward. His chest began to heave visibly under his tailored suit. That is illegal. That is federal entrapment. You cannot do this to me. Marcus stepped forward smoothly, adjusting his silver reading glasses. He looked at Preston with the cold, clinical pity a scientist might reserve for a particularly foolish laboratory rat. It is absolutely not entrapment. Mr. Sterling Marcus corrected, his tone perfectly conversational. You were never coerced into making those phone calls. You actively sought out a back channel to sell out your own family. Arthur Vance simply created a secure digital Dropbox and allowed you to voluntarily upload your own heavily encrypted files. You freely handed over the data to a private citizen. I smiled, stepping around the coffee table to close the distance between us. And you were so incredibly desperate for that fake immunity deal, Preston, I added, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. You were so absolutely terrified of spending the rest of your life in a concrete cell that you did not just send Arthur the evidence of my mother and her mortgage fraud. You sent him everything. You gave my private investigator the complete unredacted ledgers for your phantom commercial real estate fund. You handed over the offshore account routing numbers, the fake shell company registrations, and the explicit digital blueprints of your entire Ponzi scheme. You built a massive financial guillotine, and then you happily handed me the rope, I said. my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You legally confessed to every single one of your financial crimes and packaged it into a neat little digital dossier for my firm. Preston shattered completely. The polished, arrogant billionaire persona dissolved in real time, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified con artist. He grabbed the knot of his expensive silk tie and yanked it downward as if the fabric was suddenly strangling him. He began to hyperventilate, his breath tearing through his throat in loud, wet gasps. His face drained of all color, shifting to a sickly, chalky white. No, he wheezed frantically, patting his pockets as if searching for a weapon or a miraculous escape plan. No, this cannot be happening. My father will fix this. I will call my father. He is a senior partner. He knows people. He can shut this down. Your father disowned you 5 years ago. Preston. Chloe suddenly spat out from the floor, her voice dripping with venom. The entire room turned to look at her. She scrambled into a sitting position, wiping the ruined makeup from her cheeks. He cut you off when you stole from his own clients to fund your ridiculous lifestyle. You told me that in strict confidence on our honeymoon. You have no powerful law firm coming to save you. You are nothing. Preston did not even bother to defend himself against his wife and her bitter revelation. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to brace his weight against the back of the velvet armchair. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. He looked wildly around the grand living room, searching the faces of the church members, the auditors, and the lawyers. He found absolutely no sympathy. He had proudly admitted to throwing them all to the wolves just minutes prior. He was entirely alone. Please, Preston begged, turning back to me. His voice was a high-pitched whimper. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic pleading of a trapped animal. Maya, please, we are family. I can make you a partner in the fund. I can give you the offshore accounts. Just delete the files. Just tell your investigator to wipe the servers. I will leave the state tonight and you will never see me again. I swear to God I will disappear. I shook my head slowly, savoring the absolute desperation radiating from his trembling frame. You still do not understand how any of this works, Preston, I replied. I do not want your fake money. I do not want your apologies. I want you to face the exact consequences of your own breathtaking greed. A sudden sharp sound pierced the tense atmosphere of the estate. It started as a faint wail in the distance, rapidly growing louder and more distinct. The high-pitched scream of approaching sirens cut through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Preston froze, his head snapping toward the tall, arched windows at the front of the living room. The heavy mahogany doors and the thick glass could not block the approaching noise. The sirens multiplied, joining together in a deafening chorus that signaled absolute ruin. Suddenly, the entire living room was bathed in erratic bursts of color. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light sliced through the tall windows, painting the marble floors and the Persian rugs in alternating neon shades. The flashing strobes illuminated Preston and his terrified chalk-white face, making him look like a cornered ghost. The sound of heavy vehicle tires screeching to a halt on the circular gravel driveway outside vibrated through the floorboards. I took one final step back, allowing him to fully absorb the reality of his total destruction. The sting operation is officially over, Preston, announced over the blaring sirens. I promised you that I would not call the authorities regarding the mortgage fraud, and I kept my word. But I never made any promises about Arthur Vance. He forwarded your entire self-admitted digital dossier to the regional director of the FBI White-Collar Crime Division exactly 2 hours ago. The real authorities are here, and they already have your full confession. The heavy double doors of the grand foyer did not just open, they were forcefully thrust apart by the sheer weight of reality finally crashing down upon this house of lies. Heavy combat boots stomped across the pristine marble floors, echoing with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a death knell for the social elite of this family. 5 uniformed police officers strode purposefully into the sunken living room, accompanied by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing severe expressions and flashing golden badges clipped to their belts. The remaining church deacons scattered like frightened mice, pressing their backs against the expensive silk wallpaper to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The federal auditors simply stepped aside, crossing their arms, and watching the inevitable conclusion of their financial forensics. The officers did not even glance in my direction. They marched right past Marcus and David, ignoring my legal team entirely. Their eyes were locked with laser precision onto a single target: Preston. Preston staggered backward against the velvet armchair, his perfectly styled hair now falling into his panicked eyes. He raised his hands in a frantic, universally recognized gesture of surrender. "Wait!" He choked out, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of impending incarceration. "You have the wrong man. I have diplomatic immunity. I have a binding agreement." The lead detective, a tall man with a jawline carved from granite, did not slow his approach. "Preston Sterling, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal racketeering," the detective announced, his voice booming through the cavernous space. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Preston hesitated, his eyes darting wildly toward the massive crystal chandelier, as if praying for a divine intervention that would never arrive. Two officers lunged forward, grabbing his tailored sleeves and forcefully spinning him around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists severed the final thread of his meticulously crafted billionaire illusion. He was no longer the arrogant scion of old money. He was no longer the brilliant financial prodigy who had charmed his way into Patricia and her bank accounts. He was just a common thief wearing a very expensive suit. His tailored jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders as the officers yanked his arms upward. The pristine Rolex on his wrist caught the flashing blue lights from the window, mocking the absolute lack of time he had left as a free man. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the officers physically dragged him across the Persian rug. He kicked and thrashed his expensive leather shoes, scraping against the floorboards, leaving dark scuff marks in their wake. He screamed obscenities, threatening to sue the police department, threatening to call the governor, threatening to destroy my entire firm. But his words were empty, hollow noises disappearing into the cold night air as they shoved him through the front doors and out into the waiting squad car. The heavy doors swung shut, completely sealing his fate. The silence that rushed back into the room was thick, suffocating, and absolute. I slowly turned my gaze away from the entryway and looked down at the floor. Chloe was hyperventilating, her chest heaving violently beneath her designer dress. She watched the space where her husband had just been standing, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. She realized with brutal clarity that the federal net was closing and she was the very next target on the list. The realization broke her completely. She did not stand up to fight. She did not attempt to run. She completely abandoned every single ounce of the haughty pride and staggering arrogance she had wielded like a weapon since childhood. She lunged forward, crawling across the expensive rug on her hands and knees. She threw herself at my feet, her manicured fingers closing desperately around the hem of my tailored skirt. She buried her tear-streaked face against my legs, sobbing with a violent, unrestrained desperation. "Maya, please!" she wailed, her voice a jagged, agonizing sound that scraped against my ears. "You cannot let them take me. You have to stop this. We are sisters, Maya. We share the same blood. I will do anything you want. I will give you everything back. I will sign away the house. I will surrender the trust funds. Just please call off your private investigator. Call off your lawyers. I cannot survive in a prison cell. I am not strong like you." Her tears soaked through the fabric of my skirt. She squeezed my legs tighter, her knuckles turning white from the strain of her desperate grip. "I will work for you, Maya." Chloe babbled the words, spilling out in a frantic, chaotic rush. "I will be your personal assistant. I will clean your penthouse. I will scrub your floors on my hands and knees every single day for the rest of my life. I will be your servant. Just please do not let them lock me away in a cage. I have nowhere else to go. My husband is gone. My money is gone. My friends will abandon me the second this hits the morning news cycle. You are the only one who has the power to stop this nightmare. Please save me." I stood perfectly still, staring down at the pathetic, weeping mess of a woman clinging to my ankles. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no residual sisterly affection. There was only the cold, hard reality of justice finally arriving at this house. I reached down and grabbed her wrists, prying her desperate fingers off my clothing. I stepped back and forced her to look up. You did not care about being sisters when you watched Mom kick me out at 18, I stated, my voice cold. But I will make you a deal. Chloe looked up hopefully. I leaned in close. Tell everyone here what you and Mom did to my fiancé 5 years ago. The absolute silence stretched across the sunken living room like a physical weight. Every single eye locked onto the weeping woman still crumpled on the Persian rug. The remaining church deacons, the federal auditors, and my private security team leaned forward, completely captivated by the grotesque spectacle unfolding. Chloe looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting in a violent internal struggle. She glanced back at our mother, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging her to keep her mouth shut. But the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside were still painting the walls, and the distinct sound of a federal agent reading Preston his Miranda rights echoed faintly through the glass. The sheer terror of a concrete cell entirely overpowered whatever remaining loyalty Chloe held for the woman who raised her. I will tell you, Chloe gasped, her voice a ragged, breathless wheeze. I will say whatever you want, just please do not let them put me in handcuffs. Patricia lunged forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Shut your mouth, Chloe! Patricia shrieked, her carefully maintained facade of Southern elegance entirely obliterated by pure panic. Do not say another word. You are hysterical. You do not know what you are saying. Marcus stepped seamlessly between my mother and my sister, crossing his arms over his chest. I strongly suggest you remain exactly where you are, Patricia. He warned, his tone carrying the cold authority of a seasoned litigator. Let the woman speak. Chloe flinched at her mother and her screaming, but turned her desperate gaze back to me. 5 years ago, she began, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the syllables. 5 years ago, when you were engaged to Julian, we did not want you to marry him. Mom hated him. She hated that he was just a hard-working public school teacher. She hated that he drove a used sedan and did not have a trust fund or a prestigious pedigree. But worse than that, she knew that if you married him, you would leave this house. You would take your massive salary, your savings, and your absolute dedication to this family, and you would give it all to him. You would finally stop being her personal bank account. The church deacons exchanged horrified glances, their whispers buzzing like angry hornets. I kept my face perfectly neutral, a mask of carved stone, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. Keep going, I commanded, my voice echoing with terrifying calm. Tell them exactly how you stopped the wedding. Chloe wrapped her arms around her own torso, shivering as if the room had suddenly dropped below freezing. Mom realized that if you left, we would have to downsize. We would lose the country club memberships, the luxury cars, the entire lifestyle. So we found a woman, a local actress struggling to pay her rent. Mom gave me $10,000 in cash from her private account, and I paid the girl to approach Julian at a crowded bar. I paid the bartender to spike his drink. I orchestrated the entire thing. I took the photos of her dragging his unconscious body into a hotel room. I planted the fake text messages on a burner phone and mailed the evidence directly to your office. We staged the entire cheating scandal to break your heart. The collective gasp from the room was deafening. Even the hardened federal auditors looked visibly sickened by the sheer malice of the confession. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her words becoming muffled by her own shame. We knew you would be devastated, she sobbed into her palms. We knew it would completely destroy your confidence. When you canceled the wedding and locked yourself in your bedroom for 6 months crying until you threw up, we just watched. Mom told me that a broken, depressed daughter was much easier to control than an independent married one. We kept you broken so you would stay right here paying the mortgage and acting as our personal emotional punching bag. We destroyed your future to protect our bank accounts. I stood completely motionless, absorbing the brutal confirmation of the darkest secret this family had ever harbored. I had uncovered the truth weeks ago during my exhaustive investigation into their financial fraud. I had found the old wire transfers and tracked down the actress who had gladly confessed everything to my private investigator. I thought I had already processed the anger. I thought I had already cried all the tears I possessed over the theft of the man I truly loved. But hearing my own sister confess it aloud, hearing the casual cruelty and the breathtaking narcissism of their plot laid bare for the world to witness, was a fresh, agonizing physical blow. They had not just stolen my money, they had systematically, deliberately dismantled my happiness. They had watched me grieve the loss of the kindest, most hard-working man I had ever known, and they had comforted me with the very same hands that orchestrated my devastation. The sheer, boundless evil of their actions was almost impossible to comprehend. They had poisoned my mind, making me believe I was unworthy of true love, making me doubt my own judgment and self-worth. They had stolen 5 years of my life just to ensure their designer credit card bills were paid on time. Patricia could no longer contain her fury. She marched forward, her face contorted into an ugly defensive sneer. She looked down at Chloe with absolute disgust, kicking her crawling daughter away like a stray dog before turning her venomous glare directly onto me. She was not humiliated. She was not remorseful. She was entirely self-righteous. He was a nobody! Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. He was completely beneath us. You were a wealthy, highly educated woman, and you were going to throw your entire life away on a man who bought his suits off the rack. You were going to drag the family name into the mud by associating with absolute mediocrity. I did what a mother is supposed to do. I eliminated a threat. I was protecting the family image. The church members began backing away toward the foyer, looking at Patricia as if she had suddenly transformed into a monster right before their eyes. She stood there, chest heaving, genuinely believing that her twisted sociopathic logic justified ruining her own child and her life. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling nothing but absolute icy detachment. The final cord of biological loyalty snapped, leaving me completely free. "You can tell him that yourself," I stated, my voice cutting through her hysterical rant like a steel blade. I turned my back on my mother and looked directly toward the heavy oak double doors. The heavy oak double doors swung inward with a smooth, deliberate glide, pushing back against the thick tension suffocating the living room. Marcus stepped over the threshold and out of the shadows of the grand foyer. He was not the broken, defeated man that Patricia and Chloe had chased away 5 years ago. The slightly rumpled public school teacher with the off-the-rack suits and the nervous smile was completely gone. In his place stood a man radiating absolute power and undeniable authority. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, tailored to perfection over a crisp white shirt. His posture was rigid, his shoulders broad, and his dark eyes swept across the room with the cool, analytical gaze of an apex predator assessing its prey. He walked down the short flight of stairs into the sunken living room, his expensive leather shoes making a sharp, definitive sound against the marble. He moved with a quiet, terrifying confidence, stopping directly beside me. He did not look at the remaining church deacons or the federal auditors. He leveled his intense, unyielding stare exclusively on Patricia. The color instantly vanished from my mother and her perfectly contoured face. She stumbled backward, a hand flying to her throat, as if she had just seen a ghost materialize from the Persian rug. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound emerged. On the floor, Chloe let out a sharp, strangled gasp, scrambling backward until her spine hit the velvet armchair. They recognized him instantly despite the severe physical transformation and the aura of immense wealth he now projected. The man they had paid an actress to frame the man they had relentlessly mocked for his modest background was now standing in their stolen estate, looking down at them like an unpleasant stain. "Good evening, Patricia Marcus," said his voice deep and resonant, completely devoid of the polite deference he used to afford her. "I heard you were just discussing my pedigree. I thought it was only fair to join the conversation." Patricia opened her mouth, her lips trembling, but she remained entirely speechless. The sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing the man she had destroyed standing beside her daughter, looking like a billionaire CEO, was breaking her mind. "You look surprised," Marcus continued, slipping his hands casually into his trouser pockets. "You genuinely believed your little theatrical production 5 years ago was the end of the story." You thought you could hire a desperate actress, spike my drink, and completely erase me from Maya and her life. You severely underestimated both of us. He reached out and gently placed a warm, supportive hand on my lower back. The gesture was a casual, undeniable declaration of our unity. Maya found me exactly a year ago. Marcus explained, his gaze shifting briefly to Chloe, who was now sobbing quietly against the chair legs. She did not come looking for an apology. She came looking for the truth. She had already started digging through your offshore accounts and the illegal mortgage transfers. She had found the wire receipts, paying off that actress. When she laid the evidence on my desk, we did not just cry over the time you stole from us. We made a decision. We realized that simply confronting you would never be enough. People like you do not understand emotional pain. You only understand power control and money. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. So we decided to take all three. I added, my voice echoing through the silent room. We decided to build a trap so massive and so flawlessly executed that you would happily walk right into it. Marcus smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression that sent a visible shiver down my mother and her spine. When Maya approached me, I had already left teaching. I had parlayed a small inheritance into a series of highly aggressive tech investments. I was building capital, but I needed a partner with unparalleled financial brilliance to scale the operation. Maya and I formed Obsidian Holdings together. He gestured casually around the opulent living room. We are not just business partners, Patricia. I am the chief operating officer of Obsidian Holdings. I managed the hostile takeovers. I personally approved the predatory loans that you and Preston needed to keep this fake lifestyle afloat. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The church deacons began muttering frantically among themselves, finally understanding the full biblical scale of the retribution unfolding before them. Patricia swayed on her feet, her hands grasping the edge of a mahogany side table to keep from collapsing. You did not just lose your estate to a faceless corporate conglomerate, Patricia, Marcus stated, taking one slow step toward her. You lost it to us. We bought your debt. We weaponized your own staggering greed. We let Preston voluntarily send his entire criminal confession directly to our private servers. We built a financial empire for the explicit purpose of burning yours to the ground. You tried to destroy me because you thought I was a nobody. Now this nobody owns the very roof over your head. The absolute finality of his words hung in the air. There was no legal loophole left. There was no clever manipulation that could save them. Patricia and her golden child were completely bankrupt, facing federal indictment, and entirely at the mercy of the two people they had brutally victimized. For a moment, I thought my mother might actually apologize. I watched her chest heave, her eyes darting frantically around the room as her mind desperately searched for an exit strategy. But Patricia was incapable of genuine remorse. Her narcissism was terminal. Instead of begging for forgiveness, the shock morphed into a defensive, venomous rage. She straightened her spine, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Patricia spat at me. You can take the house and the money, but you will never have a family. You are dead to me. I smiled. I am glad you said that. I slowly raised my right hand, snapping my fingers with a sharp, loud crack. David moved instantly, stepping right out from the periphery. He reached inside his tailored briefcase, withdrawing a thick manila folder and pulling out a heavily aged parchment envelope. It was bound by thick twine and sealed with deep crimson wax, bearing my grandmother and her unmistakable crest. Patricia stopped breathing. Her eyes locked onto that crimson seal, and the color violently drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow. That envelope had been sitting in a highly secured federal safety deposit box for an entire decade, perfectly preserved. It was the authentic original will of Big Mama. You spent the last 10 years waving around a forged document, Patricia Y announced, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. You paid a shady notary to legitimize a fake will, giving yourself total control over this estate. You genuinely thought Big Mama was too old to see through your constant manipulation. You thought she died, leaving you the keys to the kingdom. But my grandmother was sharper than you could ever comprehend. She knew exactly what kind of monster she had raised. She knew you would try to steal everything from me the second her heart stopped beating. So she hired her own private legal counsel in secret. She drafted her true final testaments, locking them away where your greedy fingers could never reach them. I only gained access to that federal vault last week. David stepped to the center of the Persian rug, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. The federal auditors and the remaining church deacons leaned forward, their morbid curiosity overriding their desire to flee. David slipped a silver letter opener beneath the flap of the envelope. The thick crimson wax cracked loudly in the silent room. The sound made Patricia physically flinch, as if the snapping wax had actually struck her face. David pulled out heavy ivory paper stamped with authentic federal watermarks and signatures. He cleared his throat, holding the document up to the light. "This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Big Mama Sterling." David read, his booming voice filling the vaulted living room. "It supersedes any and all previous documents, including any fraudulent claims presented by my immediate offspring. I leave this world of sound mind knowing exactly who my daughter truly is." David paused, looking up from the paper to stare directly at my mother. Patricia was shaking uncontrollably, her manicured hands gripping the fabric of her designer dress. She tried to speak, but her throat was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of her public unmasking. "My daughter Patricia has lived a life of shallow vanity." David continued, reading directly from Big Mama and her sworn statement. "Her heart is poisoned by greed and false pride. She has prioritized social status over maternal love. She has utilized deceit and cruelty to manipulate those who genuinely cared for her. She is a parasite on the Sterling name. Therefore, I explicitly and entirely disinherit Patricia Sterling from my estate. She is to receive absolutely nothing, not a single cent of my capital, not a single acre of my land. I strip her of her status and her claims to my legacy." Chloe let out another loud, agonizing sob from the floor, but Patricia remained frozen. Her perfectly constructed reality was disintegrating line by line. David turned the page, his voice growing even more resolute. "I leave the entirety of my generational wealth to my granddaughter Maya." David read the pride evident in his tone. "Maya possesses the true spirit of our ancestors. She has demonstrated the resilience, the kindness, and the unyielding strength that this family was built upon. She is the rightful heir to the Sterling Empire. She is the sole executor and sole beneficiary of my true estate." Patricia shattered. The rigid, arrogant posture that had defined her entire existence snapped. Her knees buckled beneath her violently. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the stone. She did not attempt to catch herself. She hit the ground with a heavy, ungraceful thud, landing right beside the scuff marks left by Preston. Her hands clawed at the polished marble, as if trying to find a handhold on a world spinning entirely out of control. She had lost her stolen mansion. She had lost her social standing. She had lost her fake billionaire son-in-law. She had lost her freedom. But the true scope of her absolute ruin had not even been fully revealed. I stepped closer to my mother, looking down at her broken, trembling form. I wanted her to see the exact moment her entire universe evaporated. "The house and the domestic accounts are just the beginning, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that only she and the silent crowd could hear. "Big Mama knew you would bleed the domestic accounts dry to fund your ridiculous lifestyle. She knew you would mortgage this estate to the hilt, so she hid the real money. She moved the actual generational wealth completely offshore long before you ever had the chance to steal it." Patricia slowly looked up at me, her eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. Her makeup was smeared. Her elegant hair ruined her face, a mask of pure agony. "There is a deeply secured offshore trust fund sitting in the Cayman Islands," Patricia Thwers announced, relishing every single syllable. "It has been collecting aggressive compound interest for over a decade. It was entirely shielded from your fake will and your fraudulent accounting. It is currently valued at exactly $10 million. Big Mama kept it a total secret from you her entire life because she knew you would squander it." She left the cryptographic keys exclusively to me. I now control every single cent of the real sterling empire. You are not just homeless and facing federal indictment, Patricia. You are completely, utterly, and permanently destitute. The absolute finality of my words acted as the catalyst that finally snapped the last remaining tether holding Patricia to her sanity. A guttural screech tore from her throat, vibrating off the crystal chandelier above us. She scrambled up from the floor, her designer gown catching under her heel and tearing with a sharp rip. She did not care. Her eyes were bloodshot, bulging with manic desperation, as she locked her sights on the heavy parchment envelope in David and his hands. "Give me that!" Patricia roared, lunging across the rug with her manicured fingers curled into claws. "That is a forgery. You wrote that yourself, you ungrateful little witch. I am the daughter. I am the rightful heir. Give it to me right now." David did not even flinch. He took one smooth, calculated step to the right, cleanly evading her frantic grasp. Patricia had thrown her entire body weight into the lunge. With nothing to intercept her momentum, she collided violently with the massive dining table that had been pushed against the far wall to hold the evening and its extravagant catered desserts. The impact was deafening. Silver serving trays flipped into the air, raining expensive hors d'oeuvres across the floor. The centerpiece of the destruction was the sprawling 5-tier anniversary cake. Patricia crashed face first into the towering confection of white fondant and spun sugar. The entire structure toppled over, burying her upper body in a sticky avalanche of vanilla icing and crushed sponge cake. The crystal cake stand shattered, sending sharp, glittering shards flying in every direction. She did not stop screaming. She pushed herself up from the wreckage, looking like a deranged, terrifying clown. Thick clumps of white frosting smeared across her expensive blowout and dripped down her diamond necklace. Her flawless makeup was completely destroyed, streaked with dark mascara tears and sticky sugar. She grabbed handfuls of the ruined cake and hurled them blindly around the room. "It is not fair," Patricia shrieked, pounding her fists against the ruined table. "I gave up my entire youth for this family. I married a man I despised just to maintain our social standing. I hosted the galas. I paid the bribes. I kept the sterling name immaculate. That hateful, bitter old woman owed me everything. She was a vicious, spiteful hag who never appreciated a single sacrifice I made. This house belongs to me. The offshore accounts belong to me. You are nothing, Maya. You are just a pathetic little outcast who got lucky. I built this empire." I stood motionless, watching the catastrophic implosion of the woman who had tormented me for my entire existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not taunt her. I simply observed her with icy calm. The contrast between us in that moment was stark, undeniable, and deeply poetic. For 3 decades, she had relentlessly hammered into my head that I was the embarrassing failure, the unpolished disappointment who lacked the grace and sophistication required of our elite bloodline. She had demanded absolute perfection and punished the slightest deviation with devastating psychological cruelty. Now I stood before her wearing a simple, unbranded blazer, my posture immaculate, my dignity fully intact, earned through years of grueling work and unrelenting self-discipline. Beside me, Marcus stood like a stone pillar, projecting the quiet, unshakable power of a man who had built his own fortune from absolute scratch. We did not need to scream to be heard. Our power was real, tangible, and permanently cemented in the foundations of the corporate entity that now owned everything Patricia claimed to possess. Conversely, my mother was a frantic, weeping mess, covered in crushed baked goods and ruined makeup. Her entire identity had been constructed on a fragile foundation of stolen money, forged signatures, and carefully curated lies. The moment that fake foundation was kicked away, she had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. She was just a hollow, terrified parasite thrashing wildly as the host body finally cut her off. The remaining church deacons huddled near the coat check, utterly repulsed. The very woman who had spent years dictating their moral standards and judging their modest lifestyles was currently throwing a temper tantrum worthy of a spoiled toddler. They would ensure that this story completely dominated the high society gossip circles by sunrise. Patricia would not just be broke, she would be an absolute laughingstock, a cautionary tale of greed and grotesque entitlement. The heavy thud of the front door's opening pulled my attention away from my mother and her pathetic frosting-covered meltdown. The uniformed officers who had dragged Preston down the driveway now stepped back inside. They took their positions by the entryway, blocking the only viable exit. The lead detective walked slowly back into the living room. He ignored the shattered crystal and ruined desserts scattered across the rugs. He marched directly toward the corner where Chloe was cowering against the velvet armchair and where Patricia stood gasping for air amidst the wreckage of her own anniversary cake. The detective stopped a few feet away. He unclipped a thick leather-bound folder from his side and flipped it open. The pages inside were dense, packed with highlighted bank statements, sworn affidavits, and digital forensics reports. He looked from Chloe to Patricia, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. Preston Sterling has been successfully secured in federal custody, the detective announced, his deep voice cutting cleanly through my mother and her hysterical sobbing. But our business here tonight is far from concluded. He held up a certified copy of the fake codicil Patricia had used to steal the estate alongside a stack of offshore wire transfer records. Patricia Sterling and Chloe Sterling. We have extensive documented evidence of systemic wire fraud, identity theft, and the forging of federal legal documents. Your private notary has already flipped and provided a full sworn confession in exchange for a plea deal. You are both completely out of time. The detective gave a sharp nod to the two uniformed officers flanking him. They moved forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The metallic clinking cut through the suffocating silence, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. One officer stepped toward Chloe while the other approached my mother, who was still gasping for air amidst the ruined cake. You have the right to remain silent. The lead detective began reciting the Miranda warning with a cold, mechanical cadence. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Patricia recoiled as the officer reached for her frosting-covered wrist. Get your hands off me, she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. I am Patricia Sterling. You cannot do this to me. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. I will have your badge for this outrage. The officer did not hesitate. He grasped her arm firmly, twisting it behind her back with a swift professional motion that forced a strangled yelp from her throat. The first cuff clicked shut securely around her wrist, biting into the skin. Help me, Patricia screamed, twisting her neck to look desperately at the remaining church deacons huddled near the mahogany coat check. Brother Thomas. Brother William, do something. Tell them who I am. Tell them this is a terrible misunderstanding. I built the new community center. I funded the choir. You cannot just stand there and let them treat me like a common criminal in my own home. The deacons did not move a single muscle to aid her. Brother Thomas, a man who had eaten at this very dining table dozens of times, slowly turned his back to her. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, staring intently at the floorboards. The other members followed his exact lead, turning their heads away in profound, undeniable disgust. The woman they had revered as a shining pillar of their elite community had been exposed as a vicious, thieving fraud. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the spectacular wreckage of her sudden downfall. Seeing her most loyal sycophants abandon her completely broke the last ounce of fight left in Patricia. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a hollow, wheezing sound as the officer secured the second handcuff. Across the room, Chloe offered no physical resistance whatsoever. The golden child was entirely shattered. She knelt on the Persian rug, silently weeping, as the second officer gently but firmly pulled her arms behind her back. The steel cuffs locked around her wrists with a heavy metallic finality. She did not scream. She did not beg. The terrifying reality had finally pierced through her lifelong bubble of extreme privilege. Her perfect hair, her expensive clothes, and her endless manipulation could not shield her from federal charges. Stand up, the officer commanding. Patricia ordered, pulling her roughly to her feet. "You are leaving right now." They marched them toward the grand foyer. I followed closely behind, walking shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. The ultimate walk of shame began the moment we reached the heavy oak double doors. The officer shoved the doors open, revealing the crisp night air and a massive driveway bathed in the chaotic flashing of red and blue police lights. 4 patrol cars were parked at sharp angles across the pristine cobblestones. Neighbors from the surrounding luxury estates had stepped out onto their manicured lawns, watching the spectacle unfold with unapologetic curiosity. Patricia stumbled down the front steps, her torn designer gown dragging awkwardly across the stone. The sticky white frosting from the destroyed anniversary cake was still smeared across her face and matted heavily in her hair. She looked entirely deranged, stripped of every ounce of the artificial elegance she had weaponized for decades. Chloe walked slowly behind her, keeping her head bowed low, her tears dripping silently onto the cold pavement. As they approached the lead patrol car, a loud, rhythmic thumping sound drew our attention. Preston was already locked in the back seat of the first cruiser. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but he was throwing his shoulders violently against the reinforced glass of the passenger window. His face was contorted with absolute rage, his veins bulging against his neck. He saw Patricia and Chloe approaching and began screaming at them through the thick plexiglass. "This is your fault, you arrogant women!" Preston roared, his muffled voice barely penetrating the heavy doors of the squad car. "You told me the accounting was foolproof. You told me the old lady was senile. You dragged me into this mess, and now I am going to federal prison. I will testify against both of you. I will tell them everything." Patricia flinched hard at the sheer venom in his voice. The brilliant son-in-law she had paraded around high society was now eagerly offering to trade her freedom for a lighter sentence. The betrayal hit her squarely in the chest. The officer opened the rear door of the second patrol car, placing a firm hand on her head to guide her into the cramped plastic seat. Before the officer could slam the door shut, Patricia twisted around. She looked directly at me, standing under the bright glow of the porch lights. Her eyes were wide and suddenly deeply pleading. She was desperately searching for a sliver of mercy, a single tear, a sign of the terrified daughter who used to beg for her affection. She expected me to break to stop the officers and offer her a miraculous lifeline. She was incapable of understanding that the scared little girl she had tormented was dead. I stared back at her with absolute icy calm. My expression was perfectly blank and devoid of any sympathy. I slowly reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out the exact $20 bill Preston had thrown at my feet earlier. "Excuse me, officer," I said, handing it over. "This is for their commissary snacks because they will definitely need them." The officer accepted the crumpled $20 bill with a solemn nod, sliding it into his breast pocket. He shut the heavy reinforced door of the cruiser with a sharp metallic clank. The lock engaged, sealing my mother and sister inside their new reality. The synchronized flashing of red and blue emergency lights washed over the perfectly manicured lawn, casting long, distorted shadows across the brick facade of the stolen estate. A low hum of powerful engines filled the quiet suburban air as the convoy of police vehicles shifted into gear. They rolled down the long, sweeping driveway in a single file line, their tires crunching loudly against the decorative gravel. Marcus stood silently by my side, his shoulder brushing against mine as we watched the taillights disappear into the dark tree line. The sprawling property, which had been the epicenter of Patricia and her suffocating narcissism for an entire decade, felt instantly lighter. The oppressive weight of her constant demands, her cruel judgments, and her insatiable greed vanished with those departing vehicles. We turned around and walked back through the grand mahogany doors. The scene inside the foyer was a portrait of utter social devastation. The 50 remaining guests who had arrived expecting an opulent anniversary celebration were now huddled together like frightened sheep. These were the elite members of the local country club, the powerful church deacons, and the wealthy socialites Patricia had spent years desperately trying to impress. They had just witnessed their undisputed queen bee, violently dethroned, arrested for federal fraud, and dragged out in handcuffs. The absolute silence in the grand entryway was deafening, broken only by the nervous shuffling of expensive leather shoes against the marble floor. Patricia had constructed her entire social empire on a foundation of carefully curated lies and stolen wealth. That false society was now completely dismantled, permanently shattered beyond any hope of repair. One by one, the guests began to move toward the coat check, their eyes averted and their postures rigid with discomfort. A prominent real estate developer who had toasted to Preston and his fake success just an hour earlier refused to make eye contact as he grabbed his cashmere overcoat. The head of the country club membership committee, a woman who had routinely mocked my off-the-rack clothing, scurried past us with her head bowed in profound shame. Brother Thomas, the lead church deacon, stopped briefly before reaching the threshold. He looked at Marcus and then turned his gaze respectfully toward me. He offered a slow, deep nod of quiet apology before stepping out into the chilly night air. The rest of the attendees followed his exact lead. They filed past us, offering hushed murmurs of regret and stiff, uncomfortable apologies. They recognized the drastic shift in power. They understood unequivocally that the invisible nobody they had ignored all evening was now the sole owner of the very ground they stood upon. Within 15 minutes, the massive suburban house was entirely empty. The grand double doors clicked shut, leaving Marcus and me alone in the vast cavernous space. The sudden absolute silence ringing through the hallways felt almost surreal. There was no more screaming. There was no more frantic scrambling to fulfill impossible demands. The oppressive atmosphere of the Sterling estate had been completely neutralized. We walked slowly through the dining room, navigating around the shattered crystal and the grotesque remains of the 5-tier anniversary cake that Patricia had destroyed during her final unhinged meltdown. We left the ruined foyer behind and pushed through the swinging wooden doors into the kitchen. This was the exact room where the evening had begun. It was the epicenter of my daily torment, the place where I had spent years scrubbing, preparing meals, and enduring endless verbal abuse from a family that viewed me as nothing more than an unpaid servant. The kitchen was still a chaotic mess. Stacks of dirty porcelain plates and silver serving trays clattered the expansive granite countertops. The remnants of the extravagant appetizers that Patricia had demanded were scattered across the cutting boards. The air was thick with the rich, heavy scent of the lobster bisque. The massive stainless steel pot was still sitting on the back burner of the industrial stove, the thick orange liquid bubbling and popping softly over the low blue flame. Marcus leaned casually against the granite island, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not say a word, giving me the space to process the absolute finality of the night. I walked slowly across the tiled floor, my heels clicking sharply in the quiet room. I stopped directly in front of the massive stainless steel stove, staring down at the simmering pot of bisque. The heat radiating from the burner warmed my face, bringing back a flood of memories of the countless hours I had spent chained to this exact spot. I reached out and firmly twisted the heavy metal knob. The blue flame instantly vanished, cutting off the heat source. I picked up long steel tongs resting on the counter. I plunged them deep into the thick orange liquid inside the pot. I clamped the metal ends securely around the heavy soaked fabric resting at the bottom and pulled upward. The thick bisque dripped heavily as I hoisted my old stained apron out of the pot. The garment was completely ruined, soaked through with the rich seafood broth and covered in years of accumulated grease stains and burn marks. It was the physical embodiment of the miserable life I had been forced to endure. I held the dripping apron suspended in the air for a brief moment, watching the thick liquid splatter against the pristine stainless steel stovetop. Without any hesitation, I swung my arm sideways and tossed the soaking fabric directly into the stainless steel trash can. It landed with a wet thud against the plastic liner. I turned to face Marcus, wiping a single drop of broth from my wrist. "I quit," I said. 12 hours later, the morning sun broke over the horizon, illuminating a fleet of massive obsidian holdings, moving trucks rumbling up the cobblestone driveway. The heavy diesel engines growled, echoing through the crisp suburban air as they parked in a precise militaristic line in front of the grand estate. I stood on the sprawling front porch, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching my private team of professional movers swarm the property. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. There was no gentle handling or white glove service reserved for the items currently occupying my inherited home. They carried stacks of heavy cardboard boxes right past me, marching directly up the sweeping mahogany staircase to begin the purge. My specific instructions were flawlessly executed. Every single item belonging to Patricia and Chloe was to be immediately boxed, loaded, and shipped off to a heavily discounted climate-controlled storage unit on the industrial side of town. The movers systematically gutted their expansive walk-in closets, tossing their pathetic illusions of grandeur into generic plastic bins. The sheer volume of counterfeit merchandise they had accumulated was genuinely staggering. Chloe and her supposedly exclusive designer handbags were thrown into piles, revealing themselves to be cheap overseas knockoffs, with peeling synthetic leather and glued-on hardware. Patricia and her velvet jewelry boxes were emptied of tarnished brass necklaces and cloudy cubic zirconia rings. They had spent an entire decade projecting the ultimate image of untouchable high society wealth while quietly drowning in maxed-out credit cards and predatory loans. Their entire existence was a meticulously fabricated lie. I walked back inside the grand foyer, watching two burly movers struggle to carry a massive gold-painted mirror out the front door. The paint was chipping at the corners, exposing the cheap compressed wood underneath. Everything they had purchased to decorate Big Mama and her beautiful historical home was an offensive insult to her immaculate taste. Patricia had systematically erased my grandmother and her elegant legacy, replacing it with gaudy, pretentious garbage designed to make her feel like royalty. She had completely stripped the house of its warm generational character and turned it into a cold, soulless monument to her own terminal narcissism. The second the last moving truck rolled out of the driveway, my specialized team of private contractors immediately moved in. Dozens of workers wearing hard hats and tool belts flooded the property, carrying heavy demolition equipment and massive rolls of thick protective plastic. I stood in the exact center of the sunken living room, holding a wide, rolled-up tube of original architectural blueprints. Marcus stood beside me, pointing toward the vaulted ceiling as a crew erected tall steel scaffolding. The heavy air of stale perfume and cheap luxury had already begun to dissipate. We were not just renovating a house. We were performing a full-scale exorcism. "Tear it all down!" I commanded, my voice echoing clearly against the marble floor. "I want every single trace of her completely eradicated by sunset." The contractors did not hesitate. The screeching sound of power drills and the heavy thud of sledgehammers instantly filled the air. A team of men ripped the tacky metallic wallpaper off the dining room walls in long, satisfying strips, exposing the original pristine plaster beneath. In the foyer, workers carefully dismantled the obnoxious imitation crystal chandelier that Patricia had proudly installed, dragging the hideous monstrosity out to the massive steel dumpster sitting in the driveway. They peeled up the cheap synthetic rugs and tore down the heavy, oppressive velvet curtains that had blocked out the natural sunlight for over a decade. I unrolled the thick blue paper across the top of a wooden sawhorse, running my fingers over the detailed white ink schematics. These were not new designs. They were the original floor plans drawn up when my grandparents first built this magnificent estate. I was going to meticulously restore every single room to its exact former glory. I was bringing Big Mama and her vision back to life, erasing the parasitic infection that had claimed her home. The house itself seemed to breathe a massive sigh of relief as the suffocating layers of cheap gold trim and fake marble veneer were violently ripped away. Marcus handed me a red pen, pointing to a section of the expanded kitchen layout. "We rebuild it stronger," he said, his voice completely steady, against the chaotic background noise of total demolition. "We build it so nobody can ever take it away from you again." I nodded, pressing the pen against the paper, but a sudden commotion outside the massive front windows broke my concentration. The heavy wrought iron security gates at the end of the long driveway were swarming with frenzied, aggressive activity. Three large white news vans, with towering satellite dishes, had aggressively parked across the curb, blocking the street completely. Reporters holding heavy microphones and cameramen carrying thick black equipment on their shoulders were pressing their faces against the metal bars. The morning news cycle had officially broken the story. Preston and his massive offshore Ponzi scheme had hit the local networks like an absolute earthquake, and the dramatic midnight arrests of Patricia and Chloe had provided the perfect scandalous backdrop for the morning broadcasts. One particularly aggressive reporter wearing a sharp red trench coat managed to slip past the security gate as a contractor truck exited the property. She sprinted up the long, winding driveway, her cameraman struggling to keep up with her frantic pace. She spotted me standing visibly in the center of the large open living room through the uncovered bay windows. Her eyes went wide with opportunistic hunger. She practically threw herself up the front steps, holding her microphone out like a weapon as she barged right through the open double doors. Maya Sterling, the reporter shouted, her voice breathless and frantic, as the camera red light blinked to life, capturing my stoic expression. Do you have any comment on the spectacular downfall of your entire family? I stepped smoothly through the threshold, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open behind me to reveal the sprawling interior demolition. The reporter shoved her microphone aggressively over the polished brass railing, her cameraman adjusting his lens to capture every micro-expression on my face. She was vibrating with the desperate hope that I would deliver a vicious soundbite, a petty vindictive rant about my mother and sister being hauled away in handcuffs. She wanted reality television drama. I was going to give her a masterclass in grace. I stood tall, projecting the unshakable confidence of a woman who had fought to reclaim her name. I do not view this as a downfall, I stated clearly. I view this as a necessary correction. For far too long, the Sterling name has been associated with performative charity and greed. That era ended last night. My grandmother Big Mama built this family legacy on unyielding integrity and deep community service. She believed true power was about lifting people up. What happened here was a tragic deviation from her core values. The reporter blinked, thrown off balance by my calm response. She quickly recovered, thrusting the microphone closer. But your mother, Patricia, is facing decades in federal prison. She pressed, her tone dripping with sensationalism. Your brother-in-law, Preston, orchestrated a massive Ponzi scheme right under this roof. Are you saying you feel no bitterness toward the family that cut you out? Bitterness is a toxic emotion that only poisons the person carrying it, I replied smoothly. I have spent 10 years building a successful corporate acquisitions firm from absolute scratch. You cannot construct a lasting empire on a foundation of resentment or stolen money. My mother and sister made their choices, and the justice system is handling the consequences. My focus is not on their criminal defense strategy. My focus is entirely on the future of this estate and the true legacy of my grandmother. Marcus stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with me, his presence adding a silent weight of undeniable authority. The cameraman instinctively widened his shot, capturing the stark contrast between our polished professional unity and the chaotic criminal wreckage my family had left behind. So what happens to the property? The reporter asked, gesturing toward the construction crews ripping down the silk wallpaper inside the foyer. Are you gutting the house to sell it to the highest bidder? Will you flip the estate to cover the lost millions? I looked directly into the camera lens. Absolutely not, I declared with absolute finality. This property is not for sale, and it will never be flipped for a quick corporate profit. This house belongs to the Sterling legacy, and I intend to return it to the community my grandmother loved so fiercely. As of this morning, this estate is undergoing a massive renovation. When the crews are finished, this building will no longer serve as a private monument to excessive personal greed. It is being officially repurposed and rebranded as the Big Mama Foundation. The reporter lowered her microphone slightly, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. The Big Mama Foundation, she repeated the name slowly. What exactly is that? It is a fully funded corporate incubator and collaborative workspace designed specifically for young, aspiring African-American female entrepreneurs. I explained, my voice filled with fierce pride. Growing up, I watched brilliant, talented women in our community struggle to secure startup capital, battle for mentorship, and fight for a seat at tables designed to exclude them. I had to fight those exact battles on my own, without financial backing or familial support. The Big Mama Foundation will change that narrative. We are transforming the formal dining rooms into collaborative boardrooms. The Grand Ballroom is becoming a presentation theater for venture capital pitches. We will provide top-tier legal counsel, free marketing resources, and direct access to major angel investors. We are turning a house previously used to judge people into a fortress of opportunity. The reporter stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly open as she struggled to pivot her gossip segment into a serious business interview. The sheer scale of the philanthropic pivot was entirely unprecedented. She stammered, trying to formulate a relevant follow-up question regarding the logistics. But an operation like that requires massive continuous funding, the reporter finally managed to say, recovering her professional footing. Corporate incubators of that scale cost millions of dollars to launch, not to mention the ongoing overhead. Who is backing this initiative? Are you seeking outside investors to cover startup costs? I smiled, feeling the warm morning sun hit my face. I am not seeking outside investors, I stated cleanly. I am personally backing the entire initiative to ensure the Big Mama Foundation has the resources it needs to operate in perpetuity. I am officially pledging an initial endowment of $5 million effective immediately. The funds are already secured in an irrevocable trust. A stunned silence fell over the front lawn. The reporter dropped her microphone, her eyes widening in absolute shock. The cameraman let out a low whistle. The entire city of Seattle was watching the broadcast, witnessing the ultimate poetic justice unfold in real time. The invisible scapegoat, the adopted outcast who had been mocked and thrown away like trash, had not just survived. She had conquered the corporate world and instantly become a legendary philanthropist. I did not wait for the reporter to gather her scattered thoughts. I had delivered my message and was finished engaging with the media circus. Thank you for your time, I said, offering one final nod to the camera. We have a lot of work to do. I turned my back on the flashing lights and the frantic shouting of the reporters clamoring at the gates. Marcus placed a warm hand on the small of my back as we walked into the gutted foyer. The heavy mahogany doors clicked firmly shut behind us, locking us inside the promising future we had built together. Exactly 1 year later, the physical transformation of the Sterling estate was nothing short of miraculous. The suffocating velvet curtains and gaudy gold fixtures had been entirely eradicated, replaced by soaring glass panels and bright open-concept collaborative workspaces. The grand ballroom where my mother had once hosted her superficial charity galas to impress her incredibly wealthy elite friends now hummed with the electric energy of legitimate innovation and enterprise. Long, sleek conference tables filled the room, surrounded by whiteboards covered in complex financial projections and aggressive marketing strategies that would disrupt entire industries. The Big Mama Foundation was no longer just a viral news story or a vindictive promise made on live television. It was a thriving, fully operational reality. Marcus and I walked through the main corridor hand in hand, the matching gold bands on our left ring fingers catching the brilliant morning sunlight. Our wedding had been a quiet, intimate ceremony, held right here in the redesigned central courtyard, surrounded only by people who genuinely cared about our mutual happiness and success. We did not invite a single member of high society. We did not notify the local press. We simply celebrated our union and immediately returned to the grueling work that fueled our shared passion. Watching dozens of brilliant, ambitious women collaborating in the exact space we had reclaimed filled my heart with an indescribable sense of profound, lasting peace. We had built something truly magnificent from the painful wreckage of the past. Miles away from the vibrant energy of our new foundation, the atmosphere was distinctly bleaker inside the cold cinderblock walls of the Federal Correctional Facility. The sterile visiting room smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale brewed coffee. Patricia and Chloe sat directly across from each other at a bolted-down metal table, both wearing identically oversized neon orange jumpsuits. The harsh fluorescent lighting offered zero favors to their unkempt, exhausted appearances. Patricia had visibly aged a decade. In 12 months, her roots completely gray, and her fragile posture hunched under the crushing weight of her 70-month sentence. Chloe looked equally haggard, her previous aura of golden child entitlement replaced by a permanent scowl of bitter, toxic resentment. They were not discussing pending appeals or sharing comforting family memories. They were viciously tearing each other apart. Patricia loudly blamed Chloe for carelessly leaving the forged financial documents on the dining table, where the detectives easily found them. Chloe aggressively accused Patricia of forcing her into the fraudulent scheme to maintain a lavish lifestyle they could not genuinely afford. Their shrill voices echoed off the painted concrete walls, drawing sharp, angry reprimands from the patrolling security guards. They had absolutely no one left to manipulate but each other. Across the state in a maximum security facility, Preston was adjusting to his own grim reality, serving the first 12 months of a mandatory 15-year sentence for his extensive role in the wire fraud and international money laundering operation. The false, glamorous empire they had built together had completely collapsed, burying them all under the suffocating rubble. Every single illusion they had desperately clung to was stripped away forever. I stood near the massive granite island in the newly renovated kitchen, pouring 2 steaming cups of dark roast coffee. This room had once been my personal prison, the exact location where I was mocked, belittled, and ordered to slave away for ungrateful guests who refused to acknowledge my basic humanity or existence. The heavy industrial stove where my stained apron had met its satisfying end was still there, but the energy of the space had completely shifted. It was no longer a place of silent servitude. It was a vibrant place of endless opportunity and immense personal growth for future generations. I handed a warm ceramic mug to a young woman sitting across the expansive counter. Her name was Maya, ironically enough a 22-year-old software engineer who had spent the last 45 minutes pitching a revolutionary agricultural supply chain application. She was brilliant, articulate, and entirely unfazed by the intimidating scale of the room. She laid out her complex revenue models and projected growth metrics with a fierce, undeniable confidence that reminded me intensely of myself a decade earlier, when I first began trading stocks in absolute secret. She possessed the exact kind of raw talent and relentless, unyielding drive that the traditional venture capital world routinely ignored and foolishly discarded. I saw the brilliant, undeniable spark of pure genius shining brightly in her. I listened carefully as she confidently concluded her pitch, outlining the specific seed capital she needed to launch her initial beta testing phase. I did not ask her to jump through unnecessary bureaucratic hoops or question her proven technical expertise. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a heavy embossed checkbook bearing the official crest of the Big Mama Foundation. I uncapped my fountain pen and wrote out the exact monetary amount she had requested, adding an additional 20% contingency buffer to ensure she had the necessary operational runway she needed to truly succeed in a highly competitive market. I slid the signed check across the smooth granite countertop, watching intently as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated disbelief. Hot tears of genuine gratitude pooled in her eyes as she reached out to formally shake my hand, but I bypassed the professional gesture entirely and pulled her into a warm, congratulatory embrace. As she packed up her presentation materials and walked out the door to completely change the world, I stood alone in the bright, sunlit kitchen. I smiled softly, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked directly toward the large bay windows, taking in the beautiful, undeniable reality of the life I had successfully reclaimed. They said I did not have a real job. They were right. I do not have a job. I have an empire. And the best part, I built it entirely on the ashes of their underestimation.